Good evening. Tomorrow it will be 50 years to the day since James Watson and Francis Crick made the discovery of a lifetime. And tonight we devote much of the programme to that strange and momentous time. They had worked out the secret of life, how our genes pass information from one generation to the next. It has brought us DNA fingerprinting, shown us where we come from, and led to the prospect of designer babies. Later we'll hear from the pioneers how DNA will shape the next 50 years. But first, our science editor Susan Watts charts the changes the discovery has wrought so far.
In the movie, it was no ordinary brain teaser. Jeff Goldblum is hit by a flash of inspiration, the moment when James Watson finally pieced together the structure of DNA using homemade cardboard cutouts. To many, it was the ultimate eureka moment. He and Francis Crick ran down to the Eagle pub in Cambridge and made the ecstatic announcement that they'd found the secret of life. And that's exactly how the real James Watson remembers it.
The discovery was made on that day, not slowly over the course of the next week. It was simple, instantly, so you could explain this idea to anyone. You didn't have to be a high-powered scientist to see how the genetic material was copied.
Morris, we don't have that kind of time. Look.
The clue that clinched it unwittingly came from a rival team at London's King's College, led by Maurice Wilkins. Watson persuaded Wilkins to show him their best X-ray pattern of DNA. Armed with this pirated data, Watson and Crick won the race, despite the fact that it was the King's team, including Rosalind Franklin and her assistant Ray Gosling, who'd produced that decisive X-ray picture. They worked long hours at significant risk to themselves. Rosalind Franklin died of ovarian cancer in 1958, probably caused by her X-ray work.
This is the diffraction pattern of sodium DNA.
Ray Gosling still teaches at King's, where they keep the original equipment they used in 1953. The X-ray cameras, which were state-of-the-art then, and even some of the original DNA sample itself.
And without that, none of the rest would have happened.
You might expect Ray Gosling to have welcomed Watson and Crick's breakthrough for the greater good of science, but his immediate response was more grudging.
I certainly hoped they'd got it wrong again. And when I discovered the elegant simplicity of the double helix, I was certainly rather sad. I thought, my God, here we had all this data. Why couldn't we have got there?
Yeah, well, I would have felt the same. So, I mean, you don't like someone else to win the race you're in.
You build something beautiful.
Once you saw that model, you knew it was right. And that was a bit hard to take.
The model was beautiful, but not just because of its aesthetic appeal. It also neatly explained how DNA works, the copying process made possible by its structure. DNA is made from two helixes wound round each other. Each is made from a string of 4 chemicals called A, C, T, and G. Different combinations of these letters form the words and sentences that together form the coded instructions for life. Unzip DNA and you have 2 templates, allowing you to create 2 copies of the original double helix of DNA. Repeat the process over and over again, and you have a cascade that is the basis of reproduction and life itself. By the 70s, Watson, Crick, and Wilkins had won the Nobel Prize and seen their discovery transform science with the birth of genetic engineering. Scientists in California worked out how to move genes around, mixing DNA from entirely separate species that wouldn't naturally interbreed. People were shocked as scientists came up with mutant creations, like tomatoes with antifreeze genes from fish that made them frost-resistant. A whole new protest movement was born. The protests went global as the life science companies tried to sell genetically modified food worldwide. But in another field, DNA technology was almost universally welcomed. Since the 80s, DNA fingerprinting has transformed forensic science. Traces of DNA at a crime scene gave police their first DNA-based manhunt in 1986. An innocent man was freed and the guilty caught.
This is a lab where we accidentally came up with the idea of DNA fingerprinting and DNA profiling, and where we applied that in the world's first criminal DNA investigation. The speed and sensitivity of the systems have increased dramatically. So it's now possible to identify a car thief by swabbing a steering wheel. Simply by handing that steering wheel, he will have transferred DNA. Maybe a burglar's broken into your home, you've got a smudged thumbprint on the window. You might be able to get a trace of DNA out of that to enable you to identify that person.
But the inventor of DNA fingerprinting wants to go further, so we all end up with a DNA dog tag.
The simple suggestion is, why don't we extend that database to include absolutely everybody in the UK? I would favour that, but the safeguards would have to be extreme.
By millennium year, the DNA pioneers had realised their biggest dream. Craig Venter on the left and Francis Collins flanked the president as he told the world they'd cracked the entire code of the human genome, all 3 billion letters of it.
It will revolutionize the diagnosis, prevention, and treatment of most, if not all, human diseases.
The transatlantic fanfare marked a brief truce in an unseemly race between a publicly funded project, whose leaders included John Sulston, the Brit who won a Nobel Prize last year, and Venter's privately sponsored team. Venter had sped up the whole project with a technique called shotgun sequencing.
If it wasn't for the rapid sequencing of the genome, that could have taken the whole next century to unravel. And so we're at a new starting point where the exponential impact of that will be felt.
The 1990s saw DNA draw a new genetic map of man's journey out of Africa. Scientists at Oxford extracted ancient DNA from bones. Scientists went on to compare DNA from Neanderthals with DNA from modern man and declared we're not related. In 1994, Professor Brian Sykes traced an unbroken genetic link between the frozen remains of a 5,000-year-old Iceman found in northern Italy and a management consultant now living in southern England.
To think that the DNA in your very cells has come from these people who survived the ice ages, all sorts of privations, had a very different life than we have now, is still here in our own body cells, is quite something.
By comparing an individual's DNA against his database, Sykes says he can trace most Europeans back to just 7 women he calls the 7 daughters of Eve. We got Kirsty Walk's DNA tested.
She's in the clan of Ulrika, and Ulrika is not one of the 7 commonest clan mothers in Europe, so it is an unusual sequence. And Ulrika, I know, is found particularly in Scandinavia. So if I were to hazard a guess about what this tells us about Kirsty's own maternal ancestry, I'd say it's conceivable, quite conceivable, that she did, that her maternal ancestors anyway, or one of them, came over to Britain with the Vikings.
An Icelandic company is putting Viking ancestry to use for the rest of us. The island nation's unique family records allow Decode Genetics to study those with a history of disease and spot the genes responsible. For some, this simply means we get treatments faster. Others say such powerful information doesn't belong in the hands of commercial companies. It's a difference in philosophy that goes to the heart of the DNA story. Who should control the stuff of life?
Next to a major breakthrough that could save millions of lives, top scientists have unravelled the code to how our bodies work. They've studied every single gene we're made from to find ways of tackling serious diseases.
Whether you're tall or short, have black hair, red hair, whatever, it's your genes that control how you grow and what you look like. We're all made up of millions of cells, and each one contains thousands of genes. Inside every gene is a set of instructions that tells your body how it should work. The instructions are contained in a chemical called DNA. Because everything is so small, it's difficult to find out what's going on, until now, that is. Like cracking a really complex code, scientists now know what's locked up inside every gene. It's taken them 13 years to do it. So, what have they found? The big discovery is learning exactly how the instructions, the DNA, are arranged in every gene. By unravelling this code, scientists will be able to tackle some very nasty illnesses. Diseases like diabetes, cystic fibrosis and cancer are caused by faulty genes. The more a scientist knows about a gene, the easier it'll be to design medicines. A very, very long list of this information is now stored on a website, which scientists can log into from wherever they are in the world. It'll be a few years, though, before treatments are available. But now they've cracked the code, scientists have taken a giant step towards curing some of our biggest diseases.
The BBC has learned that there's been a huge rise in the number of tests for genetically inherited diseases. Over 300 are now offered on the NHS. But for many, being able to have a test brings its own problems. Fergus Walsh looks at the dilemma faced by two siblings over whether to find out if they have the same disease which is killing their sister.
Come on, keep coming. Good girl.
Suzanne Davis has CJD, not from eating infected beef. Instead, the fatal disease runs in her family. Her sister Sally knows she faces the same mental and physical decline because a genetic test for the disease proved positive.
Hello, my little butterfly. I was absolutely devastated because I wasn't expecting that. So I was very upset about that, the news, because I thought I was going to be all right.
Suzanne is slowly dying from CJD. A blood test will tell her brother Charlie if he too carries the faulty gene. More and more people are facing similar dilemmas over genetic tests. Figures released today show there are now a staggering 321 inherited diseases you can be tested for, a 25% increase in just a year. Most are for rare genetic disorders, but they include some forms of breast and ovarian cancer. Consultant neurologist Angus Kennedy says inherited CJD is extremely rare, but as it can't be treated, he understands why some people would rather not know.
If you tested positive, then that would mean that there was a further risk to your children, which could be up to 50% for each child, and therefore the decision you make may have enormous implications for other family members.
Charlie Davis has two grown-up children. So far, none has been tested. They've decided just to get on with their lives.
There's quite a few reasons why I decided not to have the test, and it's not because I'm scared. I feel happy the way I am, and if I had the test and I was diagnosed positive, I would then know what I will become.
Sally is waiting for the first signs of CJD to appear, but she's determined not to let her test results rule her life, and is training as a beauty therapist.
Eventually I want to work on a cruise ship, so I'm looking forward to it, and so I'm not going to let this disease fight me, because if I give up, I can't get my diploma, I can't walk aboard.
Hold it by the stick. Got it?
Charlie knows he has a 50-50 chance of carrying CJD like his sisters. He's determined to stay strong for them, no matter what the future holds. Fergus Walsh, BBC News.
For the first time, people with certain types of inherited cancer are being given the chance to make sure their children don't develop the disease. Scientists at London's University College Hospital can now screen the embryos of couples seeking IVF treatment to select those free of the genes that cause colon cancer. Christine McGurty reports.
Come here, let's put you in.
Emma Stevenson is healthy for now, and so is her daughter Katie. But Emma carries a gene for bowel cancer. She doesn't yet know if Katie has it, but she's uneasy about using screening to prevent the disease being passed on.
Mixed feelings, really. I personally don't agree with it. But on the other hand, different families may have gone through a lot worse than what I have, and they may want to reduce the chance of their child having the genes.
This is how genetic screening works. Several embryos are produced from the sperm and egg of the couple with a disease. One cell is taken from each of them and is genetically screened for conditions like cystic fibrosis, Huntington's disease, and now colon cancer. And the ones that are found to be free of the disease gene are implanted.
Can you see uterus here?
The first patients will begin treatment next week at this London fertility clinic. The researchers believe it's a huge step forward in preventing cancer.
This license is a landmark because for the first time we're able to screen for embryo that carry the faulty gene that is responsible for the cancer in children. And of course, when they become adult, some of them can have 50% chance of developing cancer.
Researchers have applied for permission to check for breast cancer genes next. But there is concern about babies being selected according to parents' wishes, and some are calling for wider public debate before any more licences are granted. Christine McGurty, BBC News.
One of Britain's senior policemen says that everyone's DNA should be kept on a nationwide database to help tackle crime. Kevin Morris, president of the Police Superintendents Association, says there should be a debate about the use of DNA testing to allay concerns about misuse and undermining civil liberties. Margaret Gilmore has this report.
Never has science been so effective in fighting crime. A decade ago, you needed a DNA sample the size of a 2p piece. Now one the size of a pinhead can link a criminal to a crime. At present, the DNA of all convicted criminals is kept. Soon, the database will include anyone arrested. But senior police officers suggest we should all give samples, possibly at birth.
If everybody agrees that as part of being a citizen in this country, you give the DNA so that you can help fight crime, I think that would be a better use of people's samples than trying to just take it from groups who perhaps have done nothing wrong at all.
The current database has 2 million samples. They were used to solve 21,000 crimes in 2001, up 130% on the year before. Taking a DNA sample from every one of us would be hugely controversial. Of course, it would help fight crime, but it would be a marathon job and would raise serious ethical and human rights concerns.
If 100,000 hardened, convicted criminals are committing all the serious crime in this country, given the astronomical cost to the taxpayer, why should we all be treated as suspects and not citizens?
There's also concern others will use the information.
Employers, for instance, who are trying to assess whether a person is fit for a job might see, for instance, that they have a propensity towards a genetic illness. If that be the case, wrongly, they may refuse them the job.
But police think the benefits of safer streets would outweigh any loss of civil rights that a national database could bring. Margaret Gilmore, BBC News.
A world in which newborn babies are given identity cards containing all their genetic details. One of Britain's leading scientists says that prospect is just 20 years away. Sir Paul Nurse says there would be enormous benefit being able to predict which diseases people were likely to get, for example. But it could also lead to genetic discrimination, as Fergus Waltz reports.
All kids these days have one of these, their NHS Red Book, which sets out their early health milestones. It contains everything from vaccinations to height charts and childhood illnesses. But 20 years from now, it might contain their entire genetic code. This is my son Hugo's book. Imagine as a parent knowing exactly what diseases he would get in 20, 30, 40 years' time. Would you really want to know? On the positive side, I'd have plenty of time to encourage him to lead a healthy lifestyle if his genetic identity card showed that he was at risk of early heart disease, for example. And it could help doctors to help him too. A generation from now, we can expect medicines to be tailored to the individual. So if Hugo had some kind of genetic disorder, they might be able to cure it. But there's a downside. What would it be like looking for a job in this brave new world? As well as your CV, employers might want to know your genetic details as well. That might make it not only difficult to find work, but get health insurance, even a mortgage.
I think we've got to actually bottom out what the genetics can actually tell us, and then who should know about it, and how that should be applied. These are really complicated issues, and we're going to need some time to sort them out. So even though it's not here yet, because it's going to be over the horizon, we need to discuss it now.
So there are swings and roundabouts, good and bad with genetics, like with most things. But it's essential we start discussing the potential problems now for the sake of our children's children. Fergus and Hugo Walsh, BBC News, Windsor.
Tonight, a first for British medical research. A team of scientists in Newcastle have got the go-ahead to clone human embryos for medical research. They say it's the first step towards finding cures for diseases such as diabetes, Parkinson's and Alzheimer's. But critics say it is unethical. Here's our science correspondent, Fergus Walsh.
This is the lab where medical history will be made. The Centre for Life in Newcastle has been granted a licence to create Europe's first cloned human embryo.
Now, the very words human cloning are enough to get people worried, but let's be clear, the team here at Newcastle want to use the same technique which produced Dolly the sheep, but crucially, the cloned human embryos will never be allowed to develop beyond a few days. So let's look at how it will work.
Human eggs donated from fertility treatment will have their genetic material removed. Then the nucleus of a cell from a patient containing their DNA is inserted into the egg. The egg is stimulated with electricity and begins to subdivide. It's now a cloned human embryo. Inside are stem cells, which have the potential to turn into any cell in the body. These are removed after 7 days, when the embryo is still no bigger than a pinhead. It will take many years of lab work, but the hope is that the stem cells could be reprogrammed as pancreatic cells to treat diabetics or nerve cells to treat those with spinal injuries.
It could be very, very significant because human embryonic stem cells hold a great promise in the modern medicine, because human embryonic stem cells are able to differentiate it into all cell types of human body.
Do you think it could revolutionise medicine?
Yes, definitely. I believe very strong in this.
Joan Walker has diabetes. For the past 24 years, she's had to inject herself with insulin 4 times a day. She says a cure would transform her life.
It's such a difficult thing to do, to work in the injections into my everyday life, that to think that sometime in the future I won't have to do that before every meal would be a huge improvement for me personally.
But critics say human cloning research is immoral and patients will be left disappointed. The scientists in Newcastle stress they're not promising overnight cures, but they do claim their research will one day revolutionise medicine and offer cures for the incurable. Fergus Walsh, BBC News, Newcastle.
Well, the scientist in charge of the cloning is Professor Alison Murdoch, Director of the Newcastle Fertility Centre. She joins me now. Alison Murdoch, let's look at one of the main criticisms, that you're tampering with life, that you're being unethical.
All we're trying to do is to make people who are sick better. And it's the doctor's dilemma all the time. If someone, say, has an acute appendicitis and we operate to make them better, then potentially we're tampering with what God destined. But that's what we do. That's what we're here to do. That's all we're doing now, is trying to find cures for serious debilitating diseases to try and make people better.
Now, you talk about these cures. How long before people see these cures?
Well, I think we need to be realistic about this. If we were developing a new drug product, we would be talking about several years of clinical trials before we could confirm first that it would work and that it's safe. In this particular case, this research is completely really novel in humans, so we've got a long way to go. But all the research that we do, even at the early stages, will help us to understand how these diseases develop and how better to make the therapy work in the long run. So we're now starting on the start of a long journey, and everything we do is going to be beneficial.
All right, Alison Murdoch, thank you very much. Now, it's the story of the parents who refuse to give up. For the past 2 years, we've been following the Whitakers fight to save their son Charlie, who suffers from a rare blood disorder. They created a baby boy and used his cells to try to cure Charlie. Today, it looks like they've finally succeeded. For tonight's special report, Fergus Walsh has this exclusive story of the so-called saviour siblings.
Charlie Whitaker and his parents are about to hear incredible news.
Hello.
3 months after his transplant, Charlie's rare, life-threatening blood disorder has disappeared.
So I've looked at Charlie's bone marrow, and it looks entirely normal.
Your blood works now, buddy.
Yay!
And this is who Charlie has to thank, his brother
camera's there on the
Jamie,
side.
who donated blood when he was born and gave Charlie the gift of life.
His diamond black anemia appears to be cured. We obviously still need to follow him up to be certain of that, but what we have today is extremely positive news.
The 6 o'clock news has followed Charlie's story for more than 2 years. This is what he used to have to endure at home each night. Without these drug infusions, he'd have died. His parents knew they could cure his genetic disease if they had a baby who was genetically selected to be a perfect donor. But the fertility authorities here said no, branding it unethical to create a life simply to save another. So the Whitakers had the controversial treatment in Chicago. Doctors selected the embryo, which was a perfect tissue match, the one they knew could help Charlie. Back home 2 weeks later, they got the results.
Good news.
You are pregnant. I told you you will be pregnant.
Last year, Jamie was born. Critics immediately dubbed him Britain's first designer baby, born for his spare parts. In fact, it was only blood from his umbilical cord, normally thrown away, which he donated. The final hurdle was the blood transplant, and months being isolated from infection. Now look at Charlie, free to play like any normal 6-year-old. Things are very different now for Charlie. No more blood transfusions every 3 weeks, no more painful injections every night. A normal life. It's what his parents have fought and prayed for 6 years.
Feels wonderful. It's
It feels great.
Can't explain it.
It's kind of unreal.
His energy level has changed dramatically. He's on the go constantly. His appetite has increased. It's just unbelievable, isn't it, how much he eats now? And he's just like a different person.
Charlie's now back home, reunited with brother Jamie, who's still blissfully unaware of his role in all this. The fertility authorities have now reversed their decision and say couples like the Whitakers can have this treatment here. A victory for common sense or the start of a slippery slope?
What better reason could there conceivably be for having a child than to save the life of an existing person? I don't believe there is a better reason. And you have to remember that the alternative is probably that an existing child will die, and that would be a terrible alternative.
But others are worried by news that 3 other British couples are now trying for donor babies.
I think the main problem with using this technology is that it's basically creating a child not for its own end, but for the purposes of being a donor. So you're using that child as a means to an end rather than an end in itself.
The Whitakers say their 2 healthy sons will be equally cherished. Charlie and Jamie, truly blood brothers. Fergus Walsh, BBC News.